And do you mind if Jack, are you okay with me recording once I started recording?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Yeah. So if you have questions, you can, Jack is super easy to just go, hey, I've got a question right now if you have one, or you can put them in the chat, completely up to you. So Jack, I'll let you know when you've got about 5 minutes to finish up. Okay.
Yeah, I think I remember how to use a clock.
Okay, good. I'm sure you do. Okay, I'm going on mute and I'm going to turn it over to you, Jack.
Hi, everybody. You can take your microphones off of mute as long as you're in a quiet place. And I would prefer that you just talk. And if you want to say something, just talk and we'll hear you and I'll stop. And if you don't have your camera on, I would prefer that you have your camera on. Thank you, Melanie. You know, when we do these things, after a while, you kind of feel like a little psychotic because you talk, but you don't ever really see anybody, you know. So it's really nice to see you. And just as if I was there, if we were in a classroom, you know, that visual interaction, even if there's not any words, is very helpful. So thank you all for turning your cameras on. I really appreciate it. So I can kind of go through a usual spiel here. That's not a problem. Or I could ask you, what do you want to know?
Others asked too, Jack, and we were pretty quiet about it. So I don't know if you're going to get a whole lot of response, but I think I've built you up so much to talk about what I love to hear you talk about. So I'm going to take the lead on this and say, go with your wonderful, inspirational, beautiful speech that you do.
Okay, I can take direction. First, I would like to just thank you, Kim, for giving me this opportunity. I spent 30 years teaching at university level, and it's a great environment. And it's an environment where you have the opportunity to learn, but you don't usually get to talk to the people who made the test that you might be using. So you have a great advantage with Dr. Lansdowne. Kim and I have been friends and colleagues for many, many years. I have tremendous respect for her, which is one of the reasons why I asked her to help me make these tests, because of how amazing she really is. I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of background and go right into what we've done, because we don't have that much time. So you should see my title slide, right? Everything's good? All right.
Everything's good, Jack.
I'm going to start by just giving you some background on myself, how I got to this place. We'll talk about general ability. We'll talk about equity. We'll play around with local norms and a few other things. But I really hope that you'll ask questions as we go. So actually, the really interesting thing is my interest in intelligence testing goes all the way back to 1975, not when I was swimming at Havasupai, by the way, but when I worked as a school psychologist. And I noticed that when I gave the intelligence test that I was taught to give, the WISC, and the achievement test that I was taught to give, that the questions were really similar. And as a 25-year-old, I recognized it, but I didn't really understand the threat to validity that posed and still poses today. When I had my first job as a professor at Northern Arizona University, I learned a lot about assessment of, as you might expect, the indigenous people. And when I actually did some assessment in the Supai village, it really struck me how absurd it was. Absolutely absurd it was to give a whisk to a person who doesn't really speak English that much, instead speaks their natural language and this particular person, Amanda is her name, I'm sure she's well into adulthood by now. When I wrote this report, I explicitly said, look, this verbal score should not be used as an estimate of intelligence because this young lady speaks English, but not as much as she speaks Supai language. And even though my colleagues at the time were displeased with my rejection of the whisk, I said, look, it's really simple. It doesn't make sense to decide how smart somebody is based upon how many words they can define or how many arithmetic word problems they can solve. So I wrote my first paper on equity in 1982, followed by a paper that I did with Cecilia Yazzie, one of my doc students, looking at the whisk for the Navajo children. This was like the real beginning. And then a couple of years later, I decided to publish my first tests. We called it matrix analogies test. These are basically nonverbal tests of general ability. And even way back in '85, I noted how these tests would be especially useful for identifying gifted children from very diverse backgrounds. But notice I did the research on 2,600 students, no sex differences. On race, no race differences, and yet good correlations with achievement. I replicated that with the next edition of my test, where we changed the name to Naglieri Nonverbal. Again, in 2000, I published with Margie Ronning, article in Psych Assessment, Journal of Psychoed Assessment rather, strong correlations with achievement, trivial race and ethnic differences, and then with Donna Ford. Donna Ford is an amazing professional in our field of gifted. Similar percentage of Black, white, and Hispanic children identified using a nonverbal test. This is really important stuff. It really worked. But notice my approach isn't just to say it should work. My approach is to say, I think it'll work, but let's look at the research and see. Because to me, the research is more important. The research really matters more than what I might say in a book or do in a presentation someplace. Replicated again with the Naglieri nonverbal individual form, same kind of results. And with the NNAT2, again, thousands of children studied. No race, ethnic differences, strong correlations with achievement, strong correlation with the Wechsler nonverbal scale, which I was also the author of. And then with the NNAT3. But here was the thing. People kept saying to me, what about verbal and quantitative? And Kim and Dina will tell you, oh yeah, Jack talked to us about this a long time ago. And they often tease me. Yeah, you have these interesting ideas. Well, we realized those ideas with the 3 tests that we developed. And to put it in greater context, we wanted to see if we could find gifted students. That means very smart students who can become talented. Talented meaning accomplished, knowledgeable, if given the opportunity. And we recognize that there are, in the way things have been going, is teacher referral and parent referral is not how you're going to get equity. And we also noted that, the directions for these tests are absolutely crazy. Look at the manual for the COGAT. There's like, I don't know, 25 or 30 pages of verbal instructions that you have to read. And the directions have a lot of verbal concepts and require verbal comprehension. And the actual test questions demand knowledge. And with a WISC, you also have to be able to articulate your answer, verbal expression. So knowledge is a key problem to equity. So what did we do? We decided to explicitly create tests that would be appropriate for diverse populations. That was our most important goal. And we wanted to keep this traditional kind of verbal, nonverbal, quantitative format. But what we did was we used test questions that do not require academic knowledge, but we have verbal and quantitative test questions, and guess what? They can be solved using any language. A verbal test that you can solve using any language. That's pretty cool. We took out the verbal comprehension requirements of instructions. We use multiple choice tests, so you don't need to verbally express your answer. And those were really the key elements to what we did. So how exactly did we do this is an interesting and important question. The verbal test Dina, Brias, and I worked on was really designed after the work of A.R. Luria, who's a neuropsychologist. And Luria studied the brain. And he also had a wonderful book called Language and Cognition. And in that book, he talks about a verbal concept test that he would give. And it would go like this. He would say to a patient, I'm going to say 4 words. Tell me what word doesn't go with the others. He would say rose, daisy, tulip, leaf. And he would be getting at, well, these are all flowers. A leaf is not a flower. It's part of a flower, but it's not a flower. So that concept really intrigued me. Actually, I've been thinking about doing a test like this for about 15 years. And we finally did it. And it's basically a verbal concept test. So what's the answer to this question? Which one of these 6 objects does not go with the others? Somebody just yell it out. Which number?
The basket. I can't see numbers because I'm on my cell phone, but I think the basket, lower right-hand corner.
Why the basket?
Because it has holes in it and everything else is a solid shaped container that can hold without holes.
That's a good rationale, but it's not the right answer.
Number 2, the glass that's full, because the only one
Right.
that has stuff in it.
So how do you say your name? Crystal, is that your name? The gal who just said the basket?
It's Crystal.
Crystal.
Yes.
What you did is, thank you. You beautifully illustrated how we intentionally include a distractor. That number 6, the basket, is intended to be a distractor because it is different, but the concept of all of these that they're all empty. So that's how we came to this item. Now, you know what? Truth be told, it may not be a great item. That's why we show it to you, because we kept all the good ones and we don't show people what they look like for security reasons. But we always had another option that is reasonable. Like your response was very reasonable, but we're trying to get at the concept of empty versus full. The next one, I get my system going. Oh, here's what the directions look like. We have this little avatar here, and we have the thought bubble that pops up. And then we move the 5 images that represent the same concept. And then we make the one that isn't, the pulse, a little bit. And then we zoom back to what the child, the avatar sees. They click the 5, which is wrong on purpose, so the kids see how to correct your answer, and then how to go to the next So there's the directions. Wow. It's a lot different than verbalizing all that stuff, right? Come on. Now, the nonverbal is very much like my original Naglieri nonverbal, except I've created different kinds of items. And again, I don't talk about those items because I don't want Testing Mom and all those other people who put out books that say how to get, the kid into gifted by studying this workbook. I don't want them to see what they look like, but they're basically conceptually the same as the verbal questions. In the verbal test, you had to understand the interrelationships of those parts to arrive at the answer. And the nonverbal test, exactly the same. You have to understand the interrelationship of those three designs near the question mark to understand what the correct answer is. And the same is true. I'm going to skip this because you understand how that works. Same is true for the quantitative. In the quantitative, you have to look at the numbers and understand the relationships of them and how they all go together to form a whole. And that's what makes these three tests of different content all measure the same thing, which we call general ability. General ability is what you use to solve lots of different kinds of problems whenever you need to really understand how those problems go together. So even though the content is different, what's being measured is what we call general ability. That's what Wechsler originally said his test was designed to measure.
Hey, Jack,
General
we have a
ability.
question.
Yeah.
Nicole, do you want to just go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah,
You're muted.
Oh, you're on mute.
Go ahead and unmute. There you go.
so I'm wondering is this a paper-based test or can it be alternatively delivered online? Because in the directions, they show the child on a computer.
It is online.
Okay, and then how does it deal with the ceiling effect? How does it test to, is there a cutoff to it with students according to their age appropriate levels? Does it end at the end of the test or does it like self-calibrate to maybe?
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. So think about a 5-year-old is a lot different than a 12-year-old. So you don't have the same set of questions. We have multiple forms. And the forms are very, very carefully constructed based upon our research on the difficulty of every item so that we have a full range of ability for every age group. So you're not going to have a ceiling effect. If you have a ceiling effect, you don't have a good test. It's really simple. That means you ran out of items. You didn't write items that would be challenging enough at each age. That's how that works. Good question. Thank you, Nicole. All right.
Jack, I want to add something too, please. So if we can just stop right here and put together, I'm going to go kind of in backwards order. So think about all of the things that Scott Peters talked about in his talk about the way that we treat different people differently, right? And I think that the simplicity of this maybe is a bit deceiving. So then I want you to think about how much work went into this by referring back to Angelina's talk. And so I think that when we get here, there's this moment of, well, that's really, really simple. And that's really the point, is that we want this to be something that It's really simple to understand. So regardless of the language you speak, you would still be able to look at that little avatar and have an understanding of what is going on. It always bothers me when I don't have people directly in front of me to ask this question to. So maybe just you can kind of give me a wave. How many of you have stood in front of a group of, I don't know, 25 to 30 students and administered an ability test? Right? Pretty difficult to get through all of those directions, right? So it's not a test on understanding the directions. But remember what Angelina showed us and how difficult those questions became, and all of the items that we threw out over and over and over again until we found the right questions that worked. Lisa, you have a question?
Oh, yes, I do. My question was kind of like with the simplicity of it, I think, is it allocated like per grade level, or is it sort of like if a student answers correctly, the difficulty increases, and then when the difficulty they answer another question correctly and then it increases again? Is that how the test works?
No, it's a set sequence and a set form right now. We
Okay.
will go to an adaptive testing model as we go forward.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question.
Crystal, do you have another
Crystal?
question?
Yeah, so I'm curious about, sorry, did I lose you guys? Sorry.
No, you're there.
A question about test anxiety and how these kinds of tests in general deal with something like that. As somebody who suffers from extreme test anxiety, the word, like even saying the word test already makes like, I almost never administer them in my own classroom because they make me that sick to my stomach. Just thinking about even administering a test makes me sick to my stomach. So how do these kinds of things take that into consideration, that you're going to have a kid who can show all these abilities, but you sit them down and they understand that this is a test. They know because they're so smart, but because they know that everything they know, it's like cobwebs. I mean, there's just this mental block. So that's kind of my question, is how does that deal with test anxiety?
So Jack, I'll take the first stab at this. So we just finished writing a book for Free Spirit, and one of the big portions of the chapter that I was working on included test anxiety. And so when we are, and yes, you know what, Crystal, you're right. The kids know what they're taking this for, and test anxiety is part of it. And oh my gosh, I know that that's difficult. But one of the really cool things about working on this at the level that I worked on it is that in my school, I would test all of these test items on my own kids as we went through the development of this, of my own students, not my own children. And the joy of these types of problems, I recorded kids trying to solve things. Once they get past that initial, oh my gosh, this looks different than anything I've ever seen before, it really just moves along so smoothly because it is not like something they've seen before. So we believe that this will reduce test anxiety.
I think just to add to that, I think that the second you take away the words from the test, that relieves tension immediately in children when they don't have to worry about verbal comprehension. And so, yeah, that's a good question, Crystal.
Yes, that's a good question and good response, Nicole, as well. And of course, Kim, you've seen it, up close and personal. I mean, I've been given tests like these for decades. The thing is, kids like them. But here's the thing that you need to keep in mind. The first items that the students get are so easy that the probability of them getting it right is 95% plus. And the way that we wrote the items was that every student will always start off really easy. And they understand what they need to do, but the tasks get complicated. And the layer of complexity is what makes it difficult. Not because it's obscure and you can't figure it out because the way the item was written. You always know what you need to do, but you just can't get your head around it. That's what a good item should look like. You know what you need to do, but you just can't manage it all in your head. It's too hard. And that's how we wrote the items. They're always easy at the beginning. So that gets the kids into it. And everything that we did with from the perspective of let's make it look nice. That's not a trivial thing. I learned this many, many years ago. When I started building my own tests, I used to render an item and I would show it to my daughter, Andrea, when she was like, she must have been about 8 or maybe 7. I say, Andrea, you like this? She goes, no. I throw it away and write another one. Because I want the kid to immediately say, oh, what's that? You know, what do you got there? That's interesting. That's what you want. And you only achieve that by making it look pretty. Pretty I'm not exaggerating.
Hey, Jack, Steve has a question too.
Okay.
Okay, so my question really has to do with the funding of being able to do this kind of testing. And the reason I bring that up is I teach in California in a high performing district that is underfunded compared to the county, the state, as well as the feds. And because it continues to be high functioning, there's the perception that we can always just do more with less. So what's currently happening is that we do complete universal testing of 3rd graders, and we do give them the Naglieri along with a couple of other tests. But then beyond that, to be identified as gifted, that is purely based on achievement type things, such as the Common Core tests, or we use a Star Renaissance screener for math and language. But what I really like about your test is that it doesn't rely on language to be able to perform. So whereas Common Core math, for example, became much more language intensive. And so I'm not sure that we're finding out whether our students are proficient, if it's more about the language than it is about the mathematical logic. So I guess my question really comes back to, and without getting, too specific to my case, in California, back in 2014, any categorical funding for gifted went away toward a local control funding formula, LCFF. And so when that information goes out to all the stakeholders, including the teachers, the parents, and the community, and so on, it asks about different, like, where do you want to put the money? And gifted is never even on the list, of things. And so although it's part of the special education spectrum, it's not given the exposure and the resources, understanding that those kids have needs that are just different from gen ed kids and 2E kids and special ed kids. So I guess my question really gets to, like, how do we make this available such that school districts can actually put this into motion and make it happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think I understand what's happening. And maybe it would require a longer discussion, and I'm happy to have that with you at another time. But if the kind of the rationale is, well, these kids do so well already, they don't need anything. The flip side of that is, what about the students who are really smart, but are not achieving so highly? You will find them with the nonverbal test, or the verbal test, or the quantitative, any of them, or just the nonverbal. Those are the underachieving students. And perhaps that might be a lever, where you might be able to argue, you know what, we could really bring up our achievement levels in our school by providing these really smart kids who, for whatever reason, aren't achieving at the level they could be, what they need. And perhaps that might be one way to attack it. Maybe, Kim, do you have any other ideas about that?
Um, I have so many thoughts like swirling around in my head right now. So Steve, let's you and I talk about that offline so that we can, because I do have some ideas. So let's just,
And I'm happy to join the conversation.
I think
Let's take,
if you don't mind me interrupting real quick, earlier I hadn't looked at this test from this perspective before, because I've given the NYAT for about 3 years now. And you said at the very beginning that it was a test to find potential more so than, so I thought, I was just like, what? That made that, like, it gave me chills. I had, I wasn't thinking of it. I thought it was looking for specific, but it actually is looking for children that have the potential to succeed that may not actually be succeeding at this moment. So I thought that was kind of a really neat aspect.
yeah, keep in mind, we separate gifted from talented. The gifted student could not be achieving well, but they're really smart. And we need to do something about that. So let's just, I'm just looking at the time. I'm gonna step through a couple of things. So this Ed Week research article brought out how we do sometimes measure for gifted and sometimes for talented, but the problem is the tools that we're using are too confounded. Like, if you look at the top 6 tests that are used to identify gifted kids, the only one that's not confounded with knowledge is my NNet. All the others are confounded by knowledge. And, interestingly, if you go back all the way back to 1923, Rudolf Pintner, who has a whole book on nonverbal tests, wrote that a good intelligence test must avoid as much as possible anything that's commonly learned. In a broad sense, it rests on a differentiation between knowledge and intelligence. We'll talk more about that. Just to give you an idea, if you've never actually seen IQ tests, you really should look at them. But if you know that, the Woodcock has an intelligence test and an achievement test. So my friend Tulio sent me these images a while back saying, hey, Jack, look at this. The top image are the questions for the intelligence test. The bottom images are the questions for the achievement test. And I can't see anything different about them. Tell me another word for big. Tell me another word for large. That's really just plain wrong. I think this is really just upsetting to me because that means we're hurting kids. If you look at the Binet, the WISC-5, the WJ4, the KBC, the OLSAT, and the COGAT, they are so filled with knowledge. And here's the real kicker. In our book that Kim and Dina and I will have coming out in a couple of months, we summarized race and ethnic differences for different kinds of tests. The tests at the top here, Otis Lennon, COGAT, WISC, WJ, Binet. By race and ethnicity, you get a 12 to 9-point difference. But tests that don't require knowledge, you get a tiny difference. So if you take the knowledge out of the measurement of intelligence, all of a sudden the people who you think weren't so smart really are a lot smarter than you thought. And I think that what Kim and Dina and I have done is really prove to the extent that anyone ever has proven that by taking out the knowledge in a general ability test, it changes dramatically your understanding of people. And in a lot of ways, I think psychology has done a great disservice to society by conflating tests with abilities, with people's abilities. It was more about the tests than about the people. And that's a whole nother story. But I will draw your attention to the bottom here. Even though these tests may not show psychometric test bias, these tests, meaning these tests at the top, as Worrell has said many times, because they yield large score mean differences, they're not equitable. In other words, they're not fair. And if you read the standards for educational and psychological testing, it's very clear that even if evidence of psychometric test bias is not found, a test can still be considered unfair if students who have had limited opportunity to learn get low scores. Well, it's a vocabulary test. It's an achievement test. Just, it's obvious, but we have not focused on what we should focus on. In order to find out how smart someone is, you need to find out how well they think in a way that's not confounded by what they know. So you remember that matrices test, the nonverbal I showed you? It doesn't require them to label any of the shapes or the colors, right? You just look at the images and you can arrive at the answer.
Hey,
So
Jack,
we measure thinking. Yes?
Amber has a question. And
Yeah.
I wanna forewarn you, Amber has got quite an enormous background in testing and measurement. So
Great.
she's gonna ask you a hard question.
Good. I'd like to I haven't had a hard question in a while.
Well, that kind of
Set
sets
you
the
up,
bar
Amber.
that sets the bar pretty high. I'm actually one of Dr. Chris Nichols' students. So he's here today because of the connection of me in this class. So I had told him
Great.
that you'd be
I'm so
speaking.
happy that he's there.
I come from a bit of a different perspective in being an aspiring neuropsychologist. It's a little different on like the testing that I do. And so kind of a background there is a lot of what I did at the hospital. So at Phoenix Children's, it's so dictated by managed care. What is insurance going to reimburse? And prior to kind of jumping over into private practice, I had not previously been exposed to the CAS or the NNAT, none of these sorts of measures, because a lot of what I did was very Wechsler based and Woodcock-Johnson based. And so I was curious to get a bit of insight into what in regards to, I guess on your end or how this would work, is there any information about maybe why some of this isn't covered under managed care? Because I would do a lot of testing on children who had previously just undergone chemotherapy or would have been a pre-surgical evaluation. And we typically started our testing off by wanting to get a general idea of what were some of their abilities. And a lot of what's said is like we have these hold tests and a lot of them being very verbally based. But I would have a lot of kids, particularly those who were from Spanish speaking backgrounds with English as a second language. While I could give a whisk in Spanish or speak with them in Spanish or do these expressive one word or receptive one word tests in Spanish or bilingual editions, it was really a true underestimate of their ability, which is what you were talking about in the beginning. So I guess that my question kind of is how come some of these tests, such as the CAS, which I know you're very familiar with as one of the developers, but also the NNAT, how come some of these we don't see more in hospital settings for testing? Why is there such a hold with Wechsler testing in hospitals?
Yeah, people are resistant to change. That's as simple as that. The Wechsler is an outdated test that's overinterpreted. It's interpreted way beyond what it should be, and especially by neuropsychologists, I have to tell you, who've been taught to approach the subtests as if each subtest is measuring something really usually different. And if you read any of the research, the new research that Gary Canavay and Ryan McGill and Dombrowski and Marley Watkins have done, especially in recent years, it's clear that the WISC, the WJ, and so many other of those tests, which they have studied extensively, do not have enough specific variance after you have accounted for the G, the overall score, to be interpreted. And that's at the scale and the subtest level. So that's not my research, that's not my opinion, that's the opinion of other people who I've known for decades and who I trust. Of course, what we're talking about here is worlds different than what you do in a hospital. And Tullio Otero is a neuropsychologist. He was trained by Nick Goldberg, trained by Luria. So, you read any of the papers that Tullio and I wrote on my website, or I'm happy to, Amber, if you want to have a special session, you and Chris, and we can talk about all this stuff. I'd be happy to do that. All you have to do is email me and we'll set up a day and we'll set aside some time and go through this with a lot of detail. I just did a talk last week for a school psychologist where the end of my talk was about twice exceptional children and how in my opinion, these tests are not appropriate for twice exceptional children because general intelligence model is insufficient for that. The general intelligence model is the WISC, the Binet, all those tests, Woodcock, they're all the same.
Right.
They're good for screening. They're not good for diagnostic purposes. So I'd be happy to have a session with you guys. Just
Yes, I
seriously, let's just set it up and we can talk.
Okay, I'll bring it up in supervision, so.
Yeah,
Thank
that'd
you.
be fun.
I
I'm
have
just
a
mindful of the time.
Can I interrupt you really quick?
Sure.
I have a question about with your test, is there an age, right? So they say kids' intelligence isn't stable until they're 7 or 8, and we shouldn't screen kids for gifted programming before that. What are your thoughts beyond that? Is because I'm just thinking with this not having words and things, can a younger crowd be tested with this and have it be valid?
We have done a little bit of research on 4-year-olds. But we haven't done a lot. We haven't done it on all 3 tests. And we haven't done longitudinal stability studies. And I don't think, now, if you look at the mean score by age, the means go up very dramatically in that 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 range, and then they start to level off. And there's a lot of growth even up into high school, but it's growth, but it's not nearly like it is on the bottom. That's the nature of developing children. So, but we haven't done that yet.
Thank you.
Kim, I only have about 10 minutes. I'm just thinking about what most, let's do this.
So I have a question from Dr. Nichols, actually, too. Similarities, differences with the original and revised, that's question 1. And could you speak to the role of executive functions in ability testing?
Absolutely. So the nonverbal test items on the new tests are different physically, but conceptually identical. They're all new items. I created a number of different ways of making items, but they're all still progressive matrices, and the correlation between this nonverbal and the previous nonverbal certainly bears that out, that they're measuring the same in the same way, highly correlated. I think we wrote like 600 items for all the different levels. As far as executive function is concerned, I gave a talk on that this past week. These tests are not designed to measure executive function. Of course, my cognitive assessment system is, and it does, and that's one of the things that it does more than these do. These are good for screening. They're not for diagnosis. They're not going to give us the same correlation to achievement that the CAS gives us. It's not, it doesn't have enough raw materials, so to speak. Keep in mind, with COVID, this really created havoc for our tests now, right? Because think about it, kids weren't learning at the same rate that they were previously. And now you have these IQ tests that demand knowledge. So that means that those IQ test norms are certainly inaccurate. We don't know by how much. Same is true for your achievement tests. Equally influenced by COVID. All the norms are messed up. The only tests, the kinds of tests that are not going to be influenced by COVID are the ones that are not influenced by knowledge. So that means these kinds of tests and the CAS, my CAS too, because it doesn't require the knowledge that the WISC and the WJ and all those other tests have. So COVID makes it even more urgent to move away from the traditional conceptualizations of how to evaluate intelligence. And you know what? We can do better. So this is 3 research studies here. One on each of the 3 different tests. Sample size range from 2,500 to 3,600. So this is replication of a concept. We're replicating the question, can we take knowledge out of the measurement of ability? And what impact does that have on equity? Remember, equity is about mean score differences. Equity is about, do the students know what they need to know to answer the question? So on each of these 3 instruments, by the way, the samples closely match the US population on key demographics. We got no gender differences, no race differences, no ethnic differences, and no parental education level differences. This blew me away to see this kind of evidence on the pre-publication version of the 3 tests. It's not just one study. It's not a study with 100 kids. It's 3 studies with thousands of children.
And I think it's really important right now just to pause and look at that parent education level. So when Scott Peters was talking through that entire talk, it was really about how we treat different people differently, right? I love all the other things on here, Jack, I do, but that piece that there's no differences among the education levels, that just really does just blow my mind. I'm surprised, right? Like we were surprised when we got all of this back. And so yeah, I'm thrilled with that.
Yeah, me too. And it speaks to, Kim, it speaks to what was on our minds all the time when you and I did the quantitative test. What were we always saying? It should not be that you learn this stuff. You should be able to look at it and figure it out. Same thing when Dina and I did the verbal test. And the same thing with the nonverbal test. Some nonverbal tests are influenced by knowledge. Raven's matrix, for example. I learned this in 1979 when I was making items for Alan Kaufman, and I had a Raven's matrix item open, and one of my friends came by and he asked me what I was doing. I was told him I was building this intelligence subtest for Alan Kaufman's KBC, and he looked at the item and he said, "That's easy." And I thought to myself, "Easy? What do you mean?" Well, he said, "That's just adding positive and negative numbers." He was in chemistry and he was doing that all day long. And I didn't have that mindset. I wasn't thinking about it from that perspective, right? So his knowledge of chemistry and valences allowed him to solve that problem like that. And I was looking at it, and then, when he said that, it made perfect sense. So, even a so-called nonverbal item can require knowledge. It just depends on how it was originally written. By the way, we have studied psychometric aspects with diff analysis and all that stuff, and we're getting really great results. We only have 5 minutes. What else do you want to know?
I have a question about,
Yes, you're on, Julie. I can
okay,
hear you.
perfect. Sorry, I couldn't see it. I work with children with special educational needs. And so far we're using entrance assessments to place them in a program that can support or to determine their special educational needs. Obviously the reading material that we read this week said that's probably not how this should be done, but it's a very standard conservative program. So many of these children have slow processing, and I was wondering if that test, if time is considered, how long it takes the children to actually solve these problems, because we have many children that actually can do their work, but they just need extra time and they just need a little bit longer to solve problems, especially during exams and things like that. So we give them like 25 minutes at the end of the SAT or something like that. So I'm in England, so it's not the SAT, but it's something similar to it. So is there a way that that your test would identify that or something like that?
Are you asking about speed, like people talk about processing speed? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, so processing speed and overall how long children take to solve these problems, even if they get a problem right, or if they solve the items correctly, does it say that it took them much longer to solve them?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of any kind of processing speed scores being used in that way, because lots of times difficulty and process and speed are highly correlated, right?
Okay.
The more difficult it is, the longer it takes me to do it.
Yeah.
And some kids have different tempos than other kids and all that. And the research on speed is not a very good prediction.
No?
No.
Okay.
So I would argue that's something else going on. I wouldn't really, I would be very surprised if speed is really the issue.
Okay, well, yeah, so many children, because they do have special educational needs, so it's children with epilepsy that take things like sodium valproate that does decrease their processing speed. But is there a way that shows on the test, especially the one that's taken online? No. Okay.
No, we don't have a processing speed score.
Okay. Thank you.
It's a good question, Julie. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Can we have about another minute or two?
Yeah, I know. Darn it all. I'm trying to look down through your slides to see. We talked a little bit about local norming, so we don't. Yeah, finish up here, Jack. This. Yep, I think this is where you should be.
I think that. So let me just close by saying we can do better. We can find those 1.25 million kids of color in the United States who are smart enough to be identified as gifted and have not been. And that the numbers behind that are in this PowerPoint, which you can get on our website.
Yeah, I said that I would provide it too. So, Jack, Dr. Nichols, can you just say hello so I can hear you?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So go ahead.
Jack, I just want to say thank you, Jack, for your decades of enlightenment. I first started listening to Jack at the National Academy of Neuropsychology back when we had candles to see. And Jack has always been science-based, humble, open to attack and arguments. He's always been in good humor. He's never let other people kind of put him down or criticize what he does. And you're just spectacular, and I sure appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us.
I so appreciate that. That really, thank you so very much. You know, so much of what I do is in front of the computer by by myself, and it's nice to be able to be with people. But your words mean the world to me. Thank you so much.
And with that, it is 5 o'clock. So I encourage all of you, please give me feedback on this process. You know that I'm trying to make some change at higher levels than where I'm at. So if this is something that you think was valuable, could you send me just a message in regards to that? And not just that, you know, it's wonderful and you love it. I would need a little more than that in order to pass this on. So thank you all for joining us. Have a fantastic evening.
I just want to say it was a pleasure to be with you all. I could have done a couple of hours. It was a lot of fun, but you know how to find me. You can go on my website or the Gifted Test website. You can email me. And as I said, I'm happy to spend some time talking about some other issues. Just be in touch. I'm always happy to see you. With that, good evening. It's 7 o'clock here.
You have to go make dinner, Jack. You're cooking tonight.
No big deal. No problem.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Thanks,
Bye,
Jack.
everybody.
Really appreciate it. Bye, everybody.
Bye.